Hello, it's me again, and yes, I still don't have an overlay. So what I'm going to do is, if you want to make me an overlay, send me a message on Twitter or Facebook or something. We can talk about money, because I would be willing to pay. I'm just really tired of the yellow and the room and the me doing the thing, and it's just not, no one wants to sit here and look at that. So yeah, let me know, and we can talk about it. Anyway, that aside, I have a topic to discuss today, which is about Spirit. Since I did a video previously on the Chinese law broadcasting channel about clearlove retcons, I thought I'd do one on Spirit, because there are a lot of discussions about who Spirit was, what happened with the whole Fnatic thing, because he was so hyped, and there was all this excitement about Spirit like being this really great jungler, and he was coming to Fnatic, and all this excitement about how he was going to actually be an upgrade to the team and a bunch of things. And I was skeptical from the beginning for some reasons, which turned out to be good reasons, and some reasons that turned out to not have anything to do with anything, namely Yellow Star. But we are going to discuss our three of the storylines that I've kind of heard about Spirit and what I think is actually the real storyline. The first one is one of my favorites, you could probably guess, which is Spirit was this beautiful and pristine, perfect jungler in 2014. He ganked his lanes, he got his laners ahead, he knew how to ward, he knew how to be on the map, he coordinated well with his supports. He didn't farm a whole lot, he was a low econ jungler, and then he went to China, and he was just surrounded by these terrible players who destroyed him, and he was succumbed to the pressure of having to solo carry games and just completely became this very selfish player, and he no longer knows how to trust people anymore or make friends, and yeah, you can tell this is my favorite. The second one is that the entire time he was just this selfish monster who ruined WE. He wasn't appreciative of what he received in China. He was selfish, he never built warding items, and after he left, the team was able to refine friendship and love and peace and do better than they did last year without him. And then the third one is that Spirit is perfect, has always been perfect, he's never done anything wrong, and his team has just all suck. And this has been the case since he went to WE, since he went to Fnatic, etc., etc. So these are my favorite little stories. We're going to talk about what I think is actually true, which is that I think Spirit, there's this idea that Spirit has changed radically throughout his career, and I will admit that I think I had something to do with it if you read some of my articles and going through them, because I didn't think as critically about some of the things that he did on Samsung Blue and how they had persisted, because I characterized him as a supportive jungler, and to an extent I think he definitely was, because he's always been like very vision focused. I think that if you go back and you look at some of his vision stats, especially from the 2014 World Championship, he was among the top 3 junglers in 2014 Worlds for wards per minute. He's usually pretty good about building those items, and even if you look at his stats for EULCS this summer, he was top 2 for wards per minute of junglers, even with Fnatic not necessarily being a top 2 team all the time, right? So I do think he's a very vision focused jungler, and to an extent you can see this in his time in WE2. You don't have as much stats to back that up, but and there are ways in which this was changed, which we'll get into. But I do think this is something that influenced my idea that he was supportive. But really, when it gets right down to it, Spirit just like loved farming a lot. And this has always been something that he's done really heavily and really intently. And you can see it going all the way back to Samsung Blue, right? Where he would pick these Kha'Zix picks, and he would just farm the jungle really hard, and he would come out and kill things. And if you compare some of his champion farm per minute statistics to someone who's Cacao, who's like the polar opposite of a farming jungler, you can start to see these differences. The champion stummer CS per minute data for Cacao's Lee Sin is 2.69, for Spirit's Lee Sin in summer it's 2.96. For Cacao's Kha'Zix it's 3.14. For Spirits, it's 3.45, right? So you've got like a fairly significant 0.3 minion lead on both of those. And it looks a lot more like Dandy, who is always famous for having this attitude of really hating to fall behind in CS per minute to other junglers. And Dandy is like this he is the beautiful golden child who can do no wrong, from my perspective. With caveats, of course, he's made mistakes and he's had periods where he doesn't play super well, but I think that he's this guy who's able to typically out farm his opponents and out pressure his opponents, which is really rare. But his Lee Sin CS per minute in 2014 summer was something like 2.97. So it was really, really close to Spirit's. It was 2.96. So it's like a heavy farming Lee Sin. And you have the 3.99 Dandy Rengar, the 3.89 Spirit Rengar. There wasn't really any cosmic statistics to compare, but you get the idea that Spirit is much more in line with Dandy, who people have this reputation of he always outfarmed his opponents, right? So Spirit was a very, very heavy farmer, but he didn't have the lane pressure that Dandy did. And you can see that in some of his 2014 World Champion statistics as well. Because what happened in the world statistics is he was like in the bottom 3 of junglers for percentage of team damage dealt to champions by junglers, and he was in the top 3 for gold leads at 10 minutes. And he was much more focused on farming and less focused on doing a lot of early damage. So he would do on Samsung Blues, he would go into the enemy jungler, he would focus on getting these farm leads and converting them into vision and slowing down the game. And if you guys remember, Samsung Blue had this reputation for having a really poor laning phase, right? It's not unlike Fnatic, where Spirit would farm a lot, right? And Dade and Deft would do poorly in lane, and everyone has this idea of Deft and Dade, who always just did poorly in lane. Like, Deft would straight up just die in lane sometimes. Dade has never been known for his lane trading or anything like this, so people didn't really point to Spirit at all. But Spirit wasn't doing anything to create early pressure either. And the reason why Samsung Blue was able to just do so well was because they had this idea of shoving out the minion waves, and they also were able to stay ahead of the meta and some of the picks a lot of the time and abuse a lot of those things, which is part of why people say that they collapsed at Worlds when they had the same patch for a couple months. I think when people talk about Samsung Blue and why their early game was so poor, people rarely focus on Spirit as a jungler, but I do think you have to, right? Because there's so much about early pressure that's connected with the jungler and how the jungler plays. And yes, a lot of it will come down to, well, the lanes also have no pressure either, and this was the combination that led to Samsung Blue. And when your lanes have no pressure, you can't really do a whole lot as a jungler, but this is the combination that but even if they had pressure, I don't think Spirit would do anything with it necessarily. So this is the combination that led to Blue having really poor early games, right? And it's, again, not unlike the current Fnatic, because I've hammered several times about Febiven and Reckless not being like the best laning players. Reckless, Febiven, Yellowstar being very, very low pressure laners, and then you have these constantly changing top laners, so that you're not creating pressure there either. You don't have Huni, who used to just create like all of this lane pressure, so you don't have a lot of strength in the early game for Fnatic, and this is really shown by how hard it hit them when they could no longer lane swap. Because lane swap also gives your jungler a little bit more focus, allows him to farm a little bit more. So it was just this combination of factors that led to Samsung Blue and Fnatic getting behind early. But the difference between Samsung Blue and Fnatic is, as great of players as Reckless, Yellowstar, and Febiven are, they're not Dade, right? They're not Deft. These are some of the greatest late game team fighters in the history of the game, and just like the ability for them to have the skill, and also I think the ability and the understanding of minion control has improved globally since 2014, especially in a region like Europe that will play somewhat slower games and does focus a lot more on minion control than some other regions, I think. It's just not as, you can't really, I don't think you can replicate Samsung Blue, especially not on the current patch. It's really hard. It's going to be very difficult to recreate some of those circumstances. I think that's really the crux of the issue for me, is that Fnatic in a lot of ways is like a poor man's Samsung Blue in a meta that's much harder to be Samsung Blue, and also without like the really, really key drafts and takes on the meta that Samsung Blue were also famous for. So I think this is like a really key point that people aren't looking at when they talk about what China did to Spirit, etc., etc. However, I do think that Spirit did change to an extent. So this is something that's important because I do think that maybe there's some truth to this idea that China ruined Spirit, which I don't want to say like to just keep blaming China after a year. This is the thing that's weird, is that I was perfectly happy to blame like the WE situation that he was in, this general team situation, mistrust, etc., for a good part of the year, and I gave him a lot of credit because I do think that once you get certain habits, it's really hard to unlearn them. It's really hard to adapt and fall out of these kinds of mentalities. But after a year, it starts to be less and less about what happened in China, what happened in WE, and more about things that are consistent with Spirit. And some of the stuff that did change, like he did have periods where he was slightly more aggressive. But even looking at the periods where he was in China, I think it's safe to say that the most aggressive split for Spirit has been that spring 2015 split when he was in China. He was able to use Nidalee and Rek'Sai to get around the map really efficiently so that he could keep up the farming that he liked, but also pressure lanes. And he was taking advantage of the fact that Chinese laners tend to be really aggressive. They tend to play really far forward, and so a lot of times you can just kind of take advantage of that and kill them. It's a little bit harder to do that, I think, in Europe because there's, especially the lower tier Chinese teams don't necessarily have as much coordination with where their jungler is in the map and whether or not they should be aggressive in lane. And he was just like playing out of his mind at this time, and I think part of it was just he had nowhere to turn and nothing else to do but just practice all the time. He talked about feeling sort of isolated, not being able to do anything unless you took a cab for 20 minutes, all these other aspects. So I think that contributed to him playing really well. I think in summer, though, he just kind of got fed up and frustrated with how he perceived the practice environment to be and things like this. And there were times where he would just straight spam like Fizz and solo queue, and he would say solo queue is better practice, but the way he was playing solo queue and the way he was streaming didn't seem like good practice because he would play these like really obscure off-meta picks and all these things, and sometimes he would bring them out in LPL and he would just farm again, and he wouldn't have a lot of focus on the map, and he stopped building wording and vision items early. And when you see Spirit's contributions to vision, it's still really high, but I think that he delays vision items much more than other junglers. And when I did a lot of his pathing, I noticed that junglers like Trick, junglers like Yankos, even junglers on lower tier teams like Airwalks and so on, built, which was earlier in the split obviously, built vision items like tracking knives or sight stones much earlier than Spirit. So this contributed to having low control of the early game for Fnatic, and there was just a lack of communication. You could tell from where Spirit positions on the map, and his ability to go counter jungle and his ability to take advantage of where the farm was and things like this meant that he knew where the enemy jungler was. But there was just not a good line of communication with his laners. Gamsu would overextend, bottom lane would overextend. There was a moment in the H2K series where they ended up doing this really good swap top, but Spirit went bottom, and I don't know why, but they were overextended and they got ganked and they died. And that was kind of the story of the entire H2K series. That's been the story of Fnatic all split. It's just this lack of communication flow between Spirit and the lanes, the fact that no one is exerting early pressure between Spirit and the other players. And it's not that Spirit is a bad jungler, and it's not that these guys are bad players, it's just that the combination of these things, it's very 2015 Spring Alliance, right? Where you had Froggen just farming, you had Reckless just farming, and eventually you get to this point where everyone is fed and you can teamfight late. But the problem is that you don't have the same kind of miracle working players that Samsung Blue had. You don't have the same great circumstances with the meta and things like this that Samsung Blue had. Instead, you have this very lane focused, you have to win lane, and I just think that all of these combining factors got to Fnatic and kind of ate them apart inside. I don't think it's a good idea to blame just one player, but I also don't think like letting Spirit off the hook or blaming Spirit or anything like this. It's just this is the player Spirit is, and if teams want to pick up Spirit, they should keep in mind that he's a farming jungler. He's always been a farming jungler. China didn't ruin him. He wasn't like some amazing high pressure early force on Samsung Blue. He's been a farming jungler, and he knows where the enemy jungler is, and he knows how to farm around them. But maybe his communication isn't that good, and he still has really good sense of vision control, and maybe he's lost some of the early ability to apply vision in favor of trying to get some of these damage and some of these other aspects. But there are just a lot of weird ideas about Spirit rolling around, and I just wanted to get kind of my perspective out there and to talk about why I think a lot of these ideas are just wrong. There aren't three Spirits. There's really just one, and he's played very similarly all of his career, and he's been really great at times, and it's really worked for his teams at times, but he needs a team that works well. And I think that if Spirit wants to go to another team, or Fnatic wants to keep hold of Spirit and keep like a lot of these players, they need to look at pairing him with someone who lanes with a lot of early pressure, but also has an idea or self wards, or is able to kind of have a really, really good concept of where the enemy jungler is and to create his own pressure, right? He needs to be with that kind of player. So anyway, this is my rant about Spirit retcons, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm really sorry to see Fnatic kind of break down. I know all these players are great, but honestly, this split, they didn't deserve to go to Worlds, so that's really unfortunate for them. I mean, they were just better teams. It's not like they didn't work hard. Of course they did, but there were just better teams, so good luck to them in the future.